When you think of old Hollywood, you probably imagine glamour, class, and the golden age of cinema. But behind the velvet curtains and iconic studio lots hid some of the strangest personal behaviors and fetishes you'd never expect from the stars we once idolized. Let's kick off this bizarre journey with one of the most legendary and controversial figures of the 20th century, Howard Hughes. Most people remember Hughes as the aviation tycoon, film producer, and eccentric billionaire who became the inspiration behind countless characters in books and film, including Martin Scorsese's The Aviator, where Leonardo DiCaprio portrayed his descent into madness. But what many people don't know is that Howard Hughes had obsessions that went far beyond airplanes and movies. Behind closed doors, Hughes had a deeply peculiar set of fetishes that revolved around extreme control, isolation, and very specific rituals involving cleanliness and voyeurism. His later life became defined by reclusiveness, locking himself in darkened hotel rooms, often naked, surrounded by boxes of tissue, obsessively watching films over and over again, while meticulously recording notes. But that was just the beginning. Hughes was reportedly obsessed with fingernails and tissue boxes to a fetishistic degree. He would line the floor of his residence with tissue boxes, place them under his feet, and refused to touch objects or people without wrapping his hands in napkins or gloves. He also forced his staff to follow bizarre protocols, such as only handing him food wrapped in cellophane, avoiding direct eye contact, and documenting every detail of their behavior around him. While this was often labeled as a manifestation of severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, many close to him describe these behaviors not just as compulsions but as acts he clearly enjoyed in a controlling and ritualistic way. One of the strangest accounts comes from a former associate who claimed that Hughes would require women to bathe in a specific way before meeting him, down to the temperature of the water and the exact timing of hair drying. He had a fixation with cleanliness that bordered on eroticism, even going so far as to reportedly collect and catalog used tissues and nail clippings. His relationships were also riddled with strict, often humiliating demands. Women he dated, including famous starlets like Ava Gardner and Katharine Hepburn, often remarked that Hughes was cold, mechanical, and uncomfortably obsessed with bodily habits. His fetish for control didn't stop at women, he also exercised it over the studio system. Hughes took pride in micromanaging actresses under his contract, reportedly having them measured, groomed, and even surgically altered to fit his aesthetic standards. In fact, he had a notorious obsession with breasts, which led to him designing a bra for Jane Russell during the filming of The Outlaw, though she later claimed she never wore the thing because it was so uncomfortable. His fixation wasn't just about beauty, it was about precision, ownership, and the fetishistic power of molding people to his exact standards. In later years, Hughes descended deeper into his reclusive habits, living in sealed-off hotel rooms where he'd watch the same movies for weeks, urinate in bottles, and write bizarre memos to his staff instructing them on how to open doors or speak to him. While some wrote it off as mental illness, others, including his biographers, noted that Hughes appeared to derive pleasure from these rituals, treating them not as burdens but as carefully constructed worlds in which he had complete, godlike control. Whether it was a mental breakdown or a calculated retreat into fetishistic fantasy, Howard Hughes stands as one of the most extreme examples of how wealth, fame, and personal demons can blend into something truly surreal. His legacy in aviation and cinema is undeniable, but so is the bizarre shadow of his obsessive fetishes that turned a once glamorous figure into one of Hollywood's most haunting enigmas. If Howard Hughes represented control, isolation, and obsessive ritual, then Errol Flynn was the total opposite, a flamboyant extrovert whose indulgence in pleasure became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Best known for his swashbuckling roles in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, Flynn was the epitome of masculine charm on screen, but off-screen he was a whirlwind of scandal, seduction, and some truly bizarre fetishes that shocked even his closest acquaintances. One of the most persistent and disturbing aspects of Flynn's private life was his obsession with voyeurism. Reports from the time, including memoirs from those who worked in his home, describe how Flynn had mirrors installed throughout his estate that allowed him to spy on his guests. There were peepholes in hidden compartments, cameras tucked into unexpected places, and rumors that he filmed encounters without consent, treating his home more like a stage for erotic surveillance than a place of rest. Flynn's sexual appetite was legendary, But it wasn't just the volume of partners that raised eyebrows. It was the specific scenarios he created, often involving role play, costumes, and scenarios that blurred lines between reality and performance. He reportedly had an entire room in his house styled like a pirate ship, complete with ropes and hammocks, which he used for what he jokingly referred to as nautical adventures, but many insiders believed the room was used for far more elaborate and fetishistic activities. Another strange detail that surfaced over the years was Flynn's fixation with underage girls. This wasn't just gossip. He was charged in 1942 with statutory rape involving two underage teenagers. Although he was acquitted in court, the trial exposed details about his sexual preferences that included coercive behavior, power play, and an attraction to innocence that bordered on predatory. These allegations didn't end his career, however. In fact, the phrase "in like Flynn" became popularized to describe someone who could get away with anything, which many felt was a reflection of the dangerous charisma he wielded. Flynn also had a particular interest in collecting lingerie and reportedly kept dozens of women's undergarments in locked drawers at his estate, organized by size, color, and fabric. Friends recalled how he would sometimes pull them out like trophies, admiring the textures, inhaling their scent, and recalling the stories behind each one. It wasn't simply nostalgia, it was a fetishistic act of power and memory, a catalog of conquests that he treated as sacred objects. In his autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, Flynn doesn't deny his excesses. In fact, he seems to revel in them, describing wild parties, exotic rituals, and taboo pleasures with gleeful abandon. But what he leaves unsaid is just as telling: the implication that much of his behavior veered far from standard indulgence into something more compulsive, performative, and dark. Some contemporaries, including studio executives and former lovers, later suggested that Flynn had a need to shock, to dominate, and to test boundaries, not just for pleasure, but to reaffirm his own myth. He wasn't just acting in films, he was directing his own real-life theater of desire. In the end, Errol Flynn died at age 50 from a heart attack, but the secrets he took to the grave continue to fascinate and disturb. His life was a paradox. On one hand, a magnetic icon who lit up the screen, and, on the other, a man driven by urges that turned his Hollywood mansion into a pleasure dome of shadows, secrecy, and twisted fantasy. His name remains etched in movie history, but so does the trail of whispers and rumors about the strange fetishes that fueled his rise and led to his haunting legacy. While Errol Flynn flaunted his desires in a whirlwind of chaos and charm, Alfred Hitchcock cloaked his obsessions beneath layers of cinematic brilliance and psychological manipulation. Known as the master of suspense, Hitchcock revolutionized filmmaking with classics like Psycho, Vertigo, and Rear Window. But few people outside the inner circles of old Hollywood understood the depths of his personal fixations, many of which bordered on the fetishistic and, at times, the disturbing. Behind the camera, Hitchcock exerted meticulous control over every frame of his films, but that need for dominance extended well beyond the set. He became infamous for his obsession with icy blondes, women like Grace Kelly, Kim Novak, and especially Tippi Hedren, whom he attempted to mold into the embodiment of his perfect fantasy. Hitchcock's fascination with Hedren was particularly intense and veered into obsession. He allegedly controlled everything about her image, from her wardrobe and hairstyle to the way she spoke and moved, turning her into a living character from one of his dreams. But the behavior didn't stop at creative direction. According to Hedren herself, Hitchcock made numerous unwanted advances, proposed bizarre and controlling contract conditions, and even had a private door installed connecting his office directly to her dressing room. He would reportedly follow her around the set, stare at her in silence, and send her cryptic, sexually charged notes. While some dismiss these acts as the eccentricities of a genius director, others have since re-evaluated them as the behaviors of a man indulging in a fetishistic obsession under the guise of art. Hitchcock also had a known foot fetish. Behind the scenes, he often directed unnecessary shots of women's feet, focused on them with lingering, stylized close-ups, and reportedly kept photos of his actresses' feet in his private collection. But perhaps most telling were his scripts and screen directions, where he would overemphasize physical details that seemed to reflect his personal fixations. In Vertigo, the transformation of Judy into Madeline is a visual representation of Hitchcock's own desire to recreate a woman into his ideal, much like he tried to do with Hedren in real life. It wasn't just an artistic motif, it was a deeply personal fetish played out in front of millions. His need for control, particularly over the female body and image, became a kind of erotic ritual. Hitchcock was not known for overt affairs or public scandal, but those close to him claimed his inner life was dominated by fantasy, projection, and a dark form of worship disguised as direction. He used cinema to indulge in psychological and visual fetishism, often placing his actresses in humiliating or dangerous scenarios on set, such as during the filming of The Birds, where Hedren was subjected to live birds attacking her over multiple takes, causing physical and emotional trauma. Critics now argue that these scenes were less about performance and more about Hitchcock enacting a form of sadistic fetish play under professional pretenses. Even his letters and private writings hinted at a mind preoccupied with fantasy control, erotic submission, and the power of image over substance. Alfred Hitchcock may never have been publicly scandalized during his life, but his work and legacy have become a fascinating case study in how fetishism can disguise itself as genius, and how the lines between art and obsession can blur until they become indistinguishable. His iconic status remains intact in film history, but the layers beneath his legend reveal a man whose fetishes shaped the very fabric of his storytelling, turning every close-up, every angle, and every casting choice into an intimate window into his most private and complex desires. Among the many stars whose private lives contradicted their public personas, Marlon Brando stands out as a man whose emotional intensity on screen mirrored the unfiltered chaos and complexity of his personal desires. Widely regarded as one of the greatest actors of all time, Brando was the face of raw masculinity in films like A Streetcar Named Desire and The Godfather, but beneath the surface lay a man with a labyrinth of sexual impulses, a disregard for convention, and a range of fetishes that shocked even the most jaded insiders in Hollywood. Brando never tried to hide his fluidity when it came to sex, and often boasted of encounters with both men and women, once famously stating that he had had homosexual experiences and wasn't ashamed of them. But his explorations went far beyond simple orientation. He was known to stage elaborate seduction games that involved deception, costume, and roleplay. One of the recurring stories whispered in Hollywood circles was Brando's enjoyment of pretending to be a stranger to his partners, meeting them in character in hotels or bars, and playing out intricate sexual narratives that would blur the lines between fantasy and reality. These games weren't casual. They were structured with scripts, accents, and sometimes even costumes. He treated sex like theater, and many described the experience of being with Brando as less like a date and more like starring in one of his unscripted films. But the most shocking and intimate fetish attributed to Brando was his fascination with domination and humiliation, both giving and receiving. According to some former lovers and biographers, Brando would orchestrate sexual scenarios that involved emotional degradation, particularly with lovers he felt emotionally threatened by. He enjoyed being tied up, restrained, or verbally humiliated by women in positions of power, often asking them to slap him, insult him, or take control in explicit ways. These sessions were described not as moments of vulnerability, but as Brando's way of accessing parts of himself that he suppressed in his public life. He was also known to experiment with food during sex, incorporating everything from honey to ice cubes to more extreme textures as part of sensory stimulation. Friends noted that Brando kept a closet of unusual objects, including ropes, masks, and what one described as, quote, an entire drawer of things no one should need to use unless they're writing a medical textbook. His relationships were often chaotic and combustible, and some of his partners described his behavior as emotionally manipulative and deeply psychological. He thrived on unpredictability, and many said he derived more satisfaction from the build-up in tension than the act itself. Even in his later years, Brando continued to surround himself with symbols of his sexual identity: provocative artwork, hand-picked furniture with sensual textures, and a strict policy that none of his bedroom items were ever to be moved or touched by others. For Brando, fetish was not a separate category from his life. It was life. Everything he did, from acting to eating to loving, was infused with an intensity that was hard to process for anyone on the outside. His mystique has only grown since his death, but the stories that continue to emerge paint a vivid portrait of a man who lived not only without fear of judgment, but often in defiance of it. Brando's fetishistic tendencies were just one part of a larger, uncontainable personality, one that burned through Hollywood's conventions like fire through film reel. While many old Hollywood stars kept their peculiar desires shrouded in secrecy, Mae West was one of the few who wielded her sexuality like a weapon, using it to captivate, provoke, and completely upend the expectations of her era. Known for her sultry one-liners, curvaceous figure, and razor-sharp wit, West became a symbol of empowerment and scandal during the 1930s and 1940s. But behind the winks and double entendres was a woman with a deeply unconventional set of preferences that pushed well beyond the limits of what the public ever saw. Mae West had a fetish for control, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal, physical, and psychological one. She was obsessed with bodybuilders and muscular men, often hiring them not just as companions but as human furniture. According to numerous reports and memoirs, she would have her lovers pose for hours in static, statuesque positions while she lounged across them, examined them, or simply ordered them to remain still while she carried on with other tasks. She treated their physiques like living art, and in some cases even refused to allow them to speak unless spoken to. This fetish wasn't about sex alone. It was about dominance, admiration, and the reversal of gender norms. West also maintained a private collection of erotica, including hand-drawn illustrations, BDSM artifacts, and custom-built furniture designed specifically for power play scenarios. Some of her closest staff described a secret room in her penthouse filled with ropes, padded walls, mirrors, and odd mechanical devices that no one outside her inner circle ever got to see. She had an entire wardrobe of costumes and uniforms for her partners to wear: gladiators, servants, sailors, all roles in which she maintained complete control over the narrative. She reportedly enjoyed writing her own scripts for sexual encounters, assigning lines and behaviors to her lovers as if they were actors in one of her plays. She referred to this process as directing pleasure, and to her, it was as creative an act as any of her films. Her obsession with symmetry and muscular definition also extended into daily rituals. She would perform body inspections of her chosen men, sometimes several times a day, critiquing every inch, issuing compliments or corrections, and even scheduling training sessions for them to improve the areas she found lacking. And despite the public perception of West as being promiscuous, she was incredibly selective and calculated. She was known to vet potential lovers in a style not unlike a casting call, often reducing even the most confident men to anxious statues under her gaze. Her favorite phrase, "too much of a good thing can be wonderful," wasn't just a catchy quip, it was a philosophy she lived by. And for her, pleasure wasn't passive. It was a spectacle, a rehearsal, a full-blown production that she controlled from curtain rise to final bow. In her later years, she kept her appetite alive by surrounding herself with an entourage of young men decades her junior, each selected for their appearance and willingness to submit to her whims. She reportedly continued these habits well into her 70s, defying both age and societal expectation. Mae West's fetishes were a natural extension of her identity, bold, theatrical, unapologetic, and utterly her own. She didn't just challenge the moral codes of her time. She rewrote them on her own terms, turning fetish into empowerment and desire into spectacle. In an era when women were expected to be passive and pleasing, Mae West was the director, the star, and the dominator of every scene she entered.